Hi, welcome to the Frugal Frau. I'm Sukey, your host, and today we're going to show you how to make the framing members for a flat panel door such as the one here on my left. And in the following video, or part 2, we will show you how to make the actual flat panel and assemble the whole door together. But before we get started, please like, subscribe, and comment. It helps the channel out and we really appreciate it. Thank you. All right, so we need to make doors on this cabinet, which was kind of an afterthought when we built this original cabinet behind me, which is actually covering up some plumbing, and it's going through this one too. And we had enough room, we could fit in another cabinet, and I had a need to store these buckets here. We have 2-gallon buckets and 5-gallon buckets. So that's what we're going to do. We've actually already made the bottom door and I have it here. I've already painted it with its base coat. I will antique it and then I will make a design, which I'll show you in another video, similar to this but different. And I just want to show you this frame and explain what the pieces are for those of you who are not familiar with the terminology for the framing parts. All right, this vertical is called a stile, so there's 2 of those, one on each side. This vertical is called the mullion, and that fits in between the 2 panels on this double panel door. And then the top and bottom pieces here and here are called the rails. We have attached the rails with tenons to mortises on the stiles on the top and the bottom, and those are blind mortises, or actually blind tenons I should say, because they don't go all the way through to the other side. And there's many ways to do mortise and tenons, and we just choose to do it this way because it works with the material that we have on hand. And then the mullion is attached with a simple lap joint at the top and at the bottom. This one just happens to be in a dovetail shape, and that's the only difference between the 2. The technique for cutting them is very similar. So let's go to the workshop and get started on this project. Flatten and prepare your rough sawn lumber or use pre-prepared lumber. Always check the edges for square, and if not quite square, plane them square. Tom here is using his jack plane to do this. And now he just eyeballs it, and he can see high spots where it needs to be cut down. To make the grooves for your framing members, it will be helpful to have a grooving plane such as the one shown here. Ours is made by Veritas, and this one cuts a 1/4 inch wide groove, which we set to a 1/2 inch depth. We always set the fence to ride along the back side of the framing member, so we always mark in pencil which side is the back. Whether you choose to ride along the back or the front face is your choice. Just be consistent to reduce the possibility for error. There is a depth stop on this plane, so it will not cut beyond a depth. Tom will just keep cutting until he reaches that point. We make lots of doors in our shop, so for each new project we group like tasks. Here are the 4 framing pieces, 2 rails, the upper and lower parts of the frame, and the 2 stiles, the vertical parts of the frame, have all had their 1/4 by 1/2 inch grooves cut. Measure and mark the length needed for each of the rails and each of the stiles. If you are new to making your own cabinet doors, I have provided a photo of the frame at the end of this video with these pieces clearly labeled. Tom marks the cut line with a knife cut against a square and then cuts into that line from the outside to establish a guide to keep the crosscut saw in place when he is sawing. Don't forget to mark the edge where you will begin your cut and cut into that carefully to establish a guide for your saw blade to follow when you begin the cross cut. Tom makes the cut with his homemade cross-cut saw. A crosscut saw has its teeth set to cut across the grain of the wood. The rip saw has its teeth set to cut lengthwise down the grain. The type of rip and crosscut saw is irrelevant and simply a matter of choice. Tom prefers his homemade frame-style saws for these tasks. In the next segment, Tom will be using these two different marking gauges. Tom is using the double pin gauge, which is set to match the 1/4 inch groove position in order to establish the precise width of the tenon. The tenons are cut on each end of the framing rails, and again, this is set to measure from the back. Next, he is setting the depth of the tenon, which in our style of door is 1 inch deep, and therefore it is a blind style tenon rather than a through tenon, since it doesn't travel through the entire width of the framing member. He uses the single pin marking gauge, which has been set to a depth of 1 inch. Tom has flipped the board around so he can mark all 4 sides with the marking gauges. Be sure to do this so you can cut your tenons accurately. He scribes the marks with a knife to deepen them and provide a guide for the saw blades. He cuts into those cuts to make those guides deeper and more pronounced. And here he'll start it right here. So you can see once again he's cutting from the outside into that line. Because remember, it's those 2 outside edges that will get cut, and the center portion will become the tenon. He uses the crosscut saw here to cut just to the inside edge of the tenon. Just be very careful when you do this so that you do not cut into the tenon. Next, use a chisel to cut away the waste along the inside edge of the tenon. This is possible because those are just very small pieces and they will pretty much break right along the bottom cut, and then clean it up with a chisel just to make it all nice and even, and make sure that your tenon is at that exact 1/4 inch part matching the groove. Next, Tom uses the rip saw along the marked and cut lines to cut away the waste on either side of the tenon. He is cutting parallel with the tenon first to keep these portions from ripping out into the front and back surfaces of the rail. Repeat on the other side of the tenon. Out of the vise, he accentuates the mark on the waste to be removed on the outside of the tenon. He is careful not to cut into the tenon. Now you can see that this side of the tenon is now exposed. Repeat this process on the other side. Tom cleans up the inside corners of the tenon with a chisel, just to smooth it all out. Remember, a saw is a little bit of a rough cut, and a chisel can really aid in smoothing things out. Here you can see a tenon beautifully cut with only hand tools. With all the tenons cut, Tom uses the tenon to mark the exact position on a stile section in which the blind mortise is to be cut. Note that this is the tenon for this mortise, so be sure to mark each pair of tenons and mortises independently. Develop your own marking system to keep track of this. You can see the 1-inch mark from the inside edge of the rail that Tom has marked. It is 1/2 inch deeper than the 1/2 inch groove that was previously cut. Tom uses a 1/4 inch mortise chisel to cut this mortise. It is a back and forth process to cut this. Don't get in a hurry to cut away too much waste at once. Tom uses a larger chisel to clean up the inside surfaces of the mortise. Now he's just test fitting to finesse the cut. Tom carefully shaves off a bit of the tenon that was just a wee bit too thick. Continue to test fit the tenon into the mortise until it slides in rather snugly. This looks good. Repeat this process with each of the remaining 3 mortise and tenon joints. Test fit the entire outside of the door frame, clamping it all together. Do not glue this. This will be a 2-panel door, so it also gets a centerpiece, which is called a mullion, and that is what we will make next. In this door, the mullion will be attached with 2 half-lap joints, one at the top and the other at the bottom. The mullion ends are centered horizontally on each rail. They extend to exactly 1 inch from the outside edges. Tom is marking the bottom surface of the mullion since the lap is cut away from the bottom surfaces. And here you can see that he has begun to make that cut. You can also see Tom has another piece of wood which is screwed to another piece to make kind of a T shape to be held in the vise to help keep the mullion from moving while he is cutting with a rip saw. That bottom T section, of course, is the same thickness as the mullion. Tom is now flipping the board over to cut the other side, just in the same manner. Now on the bench surface, Tom cuts away the waste using the cross-cut saw. Again, you don't want to cut into the thickness of the lap. So there, he has cut it correctly. And he rinses and repeats on the other side. One of the laps will be cut into the dovetail shape. So Tom is making that now and will simply place it in the vise and carefully cut it out. Cutting these laps as a dovetail is not necessary, but this is simply our style. We just like to make the top cabinet doors with the dovetail on the bottom of the mullion and the bottom cabinet doors with the dovetail lap on the top of the door. Tom scores the very top of the cut, and he cuts a little notch out there so it doesn't split. And he does the same on the other side. Now he will simply use his rip saw to cut carefully to the line that marks the base of the lap. With the dovetail lengths cut, he's just cutting down to the shoulder part of the base of the dovetail and picks up the saw and cuts carefully down to the other cut. Now he's going to flip the board over and do the other side to complete the dovetail shape. Once again, he uses the chisel to clean up the cut. With the mullion securely clamped in proper position onto the outside surface of the door frame, he scribes the complementary part of the lap into which the mullion will be fit. Tom repeats the process of scribing the other lap onto the outside surface of the door frame at the other end of the mullion. This lap, of course, is just the simple rectangular shaped one. This lap is the full width of the mullion. Both of these lap joint complements are cut out in an identical manner. They are first scribed along the outlines, and then these scribes are deepened with a knife, and the cuts are carefully begun with a cross-cut saw. However, most of the cut is actually accomplished using a chisel, and at the very end are smoothed out with a router plane. You will see Tom carry out this entire process. He is working on the dovetail lap complement first. We will not be showing you how to cut the complement for the rectangle because it is essentially the same process, but slightly easier since it is a rectangle. It is imperative that you do not cut any deeper than the mullion lap sections, as you want the mullion to sit flush with the rest of the frame. Now you can see that most of the waste is simply going to be cut away with a chisel. The saw marks gave a point for the chisel to cut to so that the chisel doesn't go past and out into the other part of this rail. Once again, this is just a back and forth process, and don't get in a hurry to take out a lot of material at once, especially if you are new to using chisels. Tom is using the router plane as a marking gauge since it is set to the depth needed so that the mullion sits flush into the rail. That helps him not to cut away too much material. So again, it's just a back and forth process. Once the majority of the waste is removed, use the router plane to smooth out the bottom of the cut. This saves a lot of labor, as it would be very difficult to use the router plane at an earlier stage. Sharpen and clean up the corners with a chisel. Here he's just finessing that bottom a little bit, and he's going to test fit it, and it needs a bit of adjustment. This is still a little bit tight, so he's going to have to cut away a little bit more. And where do you cut? Well, look at where things are not exactly lining up or where they're too tight. And it's just a matter of going back and forth. And of course, doing a lot of these. Okay, it fits very well now. Looks good. The process was repeated with the rectangle mullion at the other end, and here is the entire frame just fit together with just clamps. It's not glued, and you don't want to glue it up yet. The panels will still need to be made and test fit, so do not glue these frames. The next video will demonstrate how to make the panels and how to glue this door together. And for review, here's the terminology used in door framing members.